The 1980s were a turbulent chapter in British football. Terraces shook with chants, scarves waved like banners, and loyalty to a club ran deep enough to spark battles off the pitch. What began as fierce support often spilled into organised confrontations, blending sport with street warfare. In the shadow of unemployment, political unrest and gritty urban life, football became both an escape and a battlefield. This was an era of adrenaline, identity and notoriety, when the roar of the crowd could turn into the chaos of a mob. The Terraces were a sea of scarves and banners, swaying with the rhythm of chants that grew louder as kickoff approached. The smell of cigarette smoke and meat pies hung in the air, mixing with the dampness of concrete steps, worn smooth by thousands of boots. Fans clustered in groups, their voices echoing under the stadium roof. Every chant had its own tempo, starting as a murmur and rising into a roar that shook the ground. The sound was electric, charged with anticipation, each voice part of a larger force. The Terraces were not just places to watch, they were the heartbeat of the game. Fans jostled for the best vantage points, claiming spots passed down through habit and history. The sense of territory was strong. Newcomers could feel the eyes of regulars sizing them up. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken rules, understood without being explained. As the teams emerged, the Terraces erupted. The noise drowned out the referee's whistle, and for 90 minutes this concrete stage became the centre of the world. The match was only part of the story. What happened on the Terraces was just as important. Would you handle the roar and crush? Style was as much a weapon as loyalty. The casual look, designer sportswear, crisp trainers and expensive jackets was a badge of belonging. Brands like Fila, Sergio Tacchini and Adidas signalled knowledge, status and commitment to the group. Clothing choices were deliberate, blending European flair with local toughness. Looking sharp meant being ready for anything, whether it was slipping past police attention or standing out in a rival's territory. The uniform was subtle, avoiding the obvious colours of club kits. Trainers were kept immaculate, jackets zipped to the chin, and haircuts sharp. Shops near stadiums knew their clientele, stocking the latest imports as quickly as they could get them. Fashion was a code that spoke without words, recognised instantly by those in the know. For many, the clothes were more than style, they were part of the armour. A well-dressed casual could move through crowds unnoticed until the moment came to make their presence known. The subculture turned the matchday walk into a runway, blending danger with elegance. Travelling to an away match carried its own thrill. Groups gathered at local stations, spilling onto platforms in clusters, their conversations buzzing with plans. The air was thick with energy, a mix of camaraderie and the unknown. Trains became moving meeting points, compartments filled with laughter, shouted chants, and the occasional wary glance at fellow passengers. Long journeys were fueled by cans of beer and shared stories, the scenery outside flashing by in a blur. Stopping at unfamiliar stations meant scanning the platform for signs of rival groups. The arrival in a new city brought a shift in mood. Shoulders squared, eyes sharpened. The walk from station to stadium was a gauntlet, every side street a possible flashpoint. Even if the match ended in defeat, the journey itself became a story worth telling. The away day was an adventure, where the game was just one part of the experience. When tempers spilled over, the streets became the real arena. Groups moved fast, scanning for rivals, reading body language as easily as a program sheet. The sound of boots on tarmac signalled trouble before a word was spoken. Clashes erupted in sudden bursts, shouts, the thud of running feet, the push and pull of bodies. Police whistles cut through the noise, but by the time order arrived, the crowd had often scattered. Pride was measured in who stood firm and who controlled the space. These battles weren't random. They were about marking territory, defending a reputation, and sending a message. Every corner of a stadium's surroundings had a story of a past confrontation. The streets carried a memory of each clash, whispered in pubs and retold for years. For those involved, it was about more than the scoreline. Territorial pride was as fierce as any derby, and it was fought on concrete, not grass. The day often began in the pub, hours before kickoff. The smell of beer and fried breakfasts mixed with the low rumble of conversation, growing louder with each round. Groups staked out tables planning the day ahead. The pub was more than a place to drink. It was the headquarters. Maps of rival territories were discussed, routes to the ground agreed, and the order of departure carefully timed. Conversation shifted between football and the day's potential confrontations, the two topics entwined. Pints clinked, laughter rose, and the first chants of the day began here. Outsiders knew to give certain tables a wide berth. These were gatherings of people with a purpose. The pub was where unity was cemented, and the mood for the day was set. By the time the group left, the atmosphere was charged. Stepping out onto the street felt like crossing into another phase of the day. The match had not started, but the game was already on. On match days, the sight of uniformed officers was as much a part of the scene as the roar of the crowd. Lines of police stood shoulder to shoulder, scanning faces for signs of tension, ready to move before trouble could erupt. Police vans waited at strategic points, engines idling, doors open for quick deployment. Even before the first whistle, the balance between order and chaos was being tested. Mounted units added a heavy, deliberate presence. The slow, echoing clop of hooves was more than just a sound, it was a warning. Officers guided their horses along key streets, their high vantage point giving them a clear view over the crowd. Metal barriers and temporary fencing redirected the flow of supporters, forcing rival groups along separate routes in a constant effort to keep them apart. The police knew the familiar faces, the ringleaders, the provocateurs, the ones whose body language spoke louder than any chant. Quick, targeted arrests were made before tensions could escalate, though such moves often provoked jeers and shouts from the rest. Every decision was calculated, an attempt to maintain order without inflaming an already volatile atmosphere. Inside the grounds, the policing didn't stop. Officers stationed themselves in the stands, watching closely for the first sign of a surge or scuffle. In the 1980s, football policing was a tactical operation in its own right, and it played out alongside the match, every bit as intense as the game on the pitch. The tabloids knew a headline when they saw one. Front pages screamed of riots and chaos, grainy photographs showing charging crowds, mounted police, and flares lighting the air. Whether the incident had lasted 2 minutes or 2 hours, it became the story of the day, framed as a national disgrace. Television footage often told the same tale. Cameras lingered on scuffles, lines of riot police, and smoke drifting through the terraces, sometimes ignoring the actual football. The hooligan became the media's perfect villain, a character that embodied lawlessness in a time when Britain itself seemed restless. This portrayal had consequences. Parents thought twice before letting their children go to matches, fearing for their safety. More casual fans drifted away, unwilling to risk being caught in trouble. The narrative flattened all supporters into one image, regardless of whether they'd ever been near a fight. For those within the hooligan scene, the coverage was a strange badge of honour. Infamy brought both unwanted police attention and a twisted sense of pride, fueling the very behaviour the media condemned and helping the legend of the hooligan grow. When English clubs or the national team played abroad, the reputation arrived ahead of them. Travelling supporters were met with wary stares as foreign police prepared in advance for trouble. Streets near stadiums and city centres became fortified zones, lined with officers ready for the worst. The atmosphere of an overseas match was charged. Unfamiliar streets, different languages, and the thrill of being on foreign soil added to the sense of challenge. Drinking often began hours before kickoff, songs spilling into plazas and narrow lanes, the sight of a scarf or jersey enough to start a confrontation. Sometimes the clashes were planned, arranged through word of mouth and knowing nods. Other times, they flared from a sudden spark, a look, a shove, a chant shouted too close. For many, these matches were not just about the club, but about representing their country, and the stakes felt higher than at home. Back in Britain, these trips became part of the folklore. Overseas tours were trophies of their own, with stories retold in pubs for years, blending fact and bravado into legend. By the middle of the decade, the government had declared football violence a national issue. New legislation carried tougher penalties for disorder, and banning orders kept known troublemakers from entering stadiums or travelling to matches. The intent was clear: dismantle the culture by keeping its most active members away. Policing methods grew more sophisticated. Intelligence units tracked groups across the country, keeping files on names, faces, and known associates. Away travel was tightly controlled, with special trains under police escort, and entire motorways monitored on big match days. For some, this only forced the violence underground. Meetings were shifted away from stadiums to secluded areas, often far from police patrols. The game of cat and mouse changed shape, but the intent remained stubbornly alive. Still, the pressure took its toll. The combination of bans, fines, and prison sentences began to thin the ranks, and by the decade's end, the old patterns were harder to sustain. By the late 1980s, the matchday experience had begun to transform. All-seater stadiums replaced the crumbling terraces, and higher ticket prices changed the makeup of the crowd. The raw edge of the terraces was replaced with something more controlled and commercially polished. The heavier police presence, new laws, and tighter surveillance left little room for organised hooligan groups to operate in the open. Younger supporters came of age in a different culture, where football was more about spectacle than territory. The organised violence began to fade, surviving only in smaller, less visible pockets. Some of those who once lived for the rush of matchday clashes became seasoned ticket holders, swapping adrenaline for routine. Others drifted away entirely, their energy redirected into work, family, or other pursuits. The tribal culture of the Terraces was reshaped, no longer the defining feature of British football support. By the early 1990s, the hooligan era was slipping into memory. It remained part of football's history, half cautionary tale, half legend, remembered differently depending on which side of the terrace you had stood. The hooligan culture of the 1980s was as much a reflection of its time as it was a football phenomenon. It grew from loyalty, identity, and the tensions of a changing Britain, fueled by the electricity of the terraces and the pride of belonging. The chants, the fashion, the rivalries, they were all part of a world that existed in the shadow of the game itself. As laws tightened, stadiums modernised, and society moved on, that world faded into memory. For some, it remains a warning. For others, a nostalgic chapter in football history. Either way, it left a mark on the sport and the streets it once ruled. Subscribe and join us as we continue to explore the untold stories behind Britain's most unforgettable eras.